So you want to get into video but don't really know where to start? Well, in the next 10 minutes, I'm going to break down the basics so that way you can get creating videos as soon as possible. Let's get into it. What is going on, everybody? If you're new around here, my name is Finn Badgley. I am a commercial fashion and portrait photographer and content creator, and today I'm going to walk you through some video basics to get you starting to create some amazing videos today. So basically, when you are setting up your camera, you're going to do things a little differently than if you were setting it up for photography. So off the bat, for photography, you know the idea of having your shutter speed match your focal length. Well, that does not apply for video, so throw that out the window right off the bat. The idea for video is whatever frame rate you are in, you want to double that with your shutter speed. If you're on a cinema camera, you would want to have a 180-degree shutter angle. Shutter angle basically is the same thing as shutter speed. This is just when we are talking about cinema cameras. If you're on something like a DSLR, mirrorless camera, it's just going to be shutter speed. So with that in mind, if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, you would want your shutter speed to be 1/50, 1/50th, because that is as close as you can get to 1/48th of a second, at least if you are using 24 frames per second. If you're using 25, like some people do in the UK, or if you're using 30 frames per second, let's say, if you're using 30p, then you would want to have your shutter speed be 1/60, 1/60th. Now, this same rule applies as you go higher in your frame rate, which is why the slower motion you do, the more slow-mo footage you get. If you want to get that creamy B-roll, you're going to need more light in your shot, which is why you'd either want to shoot outside or have some pretty bright lights to expose your scene properly without pushing your ISO too much. So with that in mind, if you're shooting at 60p, 60 frames per second, you would have a shutter speed of 1/120 or 1/120th of a second. If you're shooting at 120p, then you would want 1/240th of a second, 1/250, anything in around there, whichever your camera will actually go to. You want it as close to twice that shutter speed as you can. Now, the reason you want this is because it has the most true to life look to it. If you have your shutter speed too low, you're going to get this weird, blurry, distorted effect, which you might want for a kind of dreamy or intoxicated look, like they sometimes do in certain films for a stylistic effect. Now, that said as well, if it's brighter outside, you probably don't want to crank your shutter unless you're doing some fast-paced action stuff to really have that come out nice and sharp, because otherwise it will look very unnatural to the eye. So that double your frame rate rule kind of applies for when you want it to look nice and natural. And if you're going for any stylistic effect, that is when you would break that rule. So with that in mind, when you're outside, if it is a glaring, bright, sunny day, your ISO is down as low as it'll go, and you still want to have a bit of blur in the depth of field. You don't want to be all the way at f/22 and have just everything in focus, and it just won't give you much separation. That is when you will slap on a neutral density filter. You can either get variable NDs or full stop ND filters that will bring down the light, allowing you to open up your f-stop or t-stop if you're on a cinema lens. You open up your aperture so that way you can expose your scene correctly. Basically, an ND filter is like sunglasses for your camera. A variable ND will give you more flexibility, but sometimes you'll get weird crosses in vignetting unless you get a really high quality one, which if you're going to go that route, I always definitely recommend. I'll insert a clip of the one that I use here. I'm not sponsored. This is just what I like and what works for me, and I found that it's worked pretty well. I don't get too much vignetting until I'm all the way down to the full ND, where it will go as dark as it can, and then I get a little bit of vignetting there. So definitely be aware of that. Now, something that you'll want to keep in mind is getting stable footage, especially if you're not locked off on a tripod, on a slider, dolly, anything like that. If you're hand holding your camera, there are a couple things that you can do to get more stable footage. I do have a full video breaking down how to get the most stable footage, link to that guy up here. But as a quick reference guide, you either want to make your camera heavier by adding different accessories to weigh it down, add as many points of contact as you can. This might include wrapping a strap around your neck or putting the camera on something like a shoulder rig. Now, another way to get you more stable footage is actually shoot at a higher frame rate and then slow it down so any wobble, any micro jitters become slower and more gradual and therefore look more natural. But if you're shooting anything with dialogue or anything like that, you obviously don't want to do that. So be wary of when you can and when you can't get away with that trick. And with ISO, ASA, EI, whichever you call it, they all mean the same thing. Your sensor sensitivity, I set it to what works best for that scenario. Sometimes certain cameras will have a native ISO, which is usually going to look the best. Some have a dual native ISO, and if you can keep it to those numbers, that'll give you the best image possible, allowing for a decent sensitivity to light, but also while having the lowest amount of grain. So always make sure to look for that on your camera so that way you get the best image possible. Now, you heard me mention earlier about f-stop and t-stop and that sort of thing. Basically, they refer to the same idea, the aperture. If you are on a photography lens, it's going to read as an f-stop. If you're on a cinema lens, it'll have the gears and the unclicked aperture, so that way you can hook up some follow focus, iris, and zoom controls. That way it will move nice and seamlessly like we do on large film sets. That t-stop is still your aperture, and it still refers to the amount of light being let in, just in a different way, but you can pretty much take them as the very similar thing. If you have a T2.9, it's going to be very similar to an f2.9. It's just you're on a different lens and the mechanics of it are just slightly different, so nothing huge, just to keep that in mind. So if you've been looking to break into video and cinematography, this is a quick reference guide to break down the basics to get you creating the most cinematic visuals possible, and I look forward to seeing what you guys create. If you enjoyed this video and got some value out of it, be sure to drop a like down below and leave a comment if you like this sort of thing and you want to see more video tips from me in the future. Subscribe if you haven't already. Hit the bell to be notified when I post new videos so you never miss an upload. Work hard, rest often, and as always, I will see you on the next one.